Welcome to the Diversity in STEM podcast, where we interview leaders in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to help inspire students of all ages. My name is Joe Kent, and I'm the Director of Education for the National Atomic Testing Museum. In 2018, the Pew Research Center found that while Latinx individuals comprise 16% of all US workers, they account for only 7% of STEM employees. This data supports the argument that STEM-related institutions have some catching up to do to mirror the wider workforce. To speak about the current experiences of Latinx people in STEM careers, we've gathered together three distinguished guests that may be familiar to regular listeners of this podcast. Now, jumping right in, how did each of you end up in the STEM fields?
So Joe, this is David. The way I ended up in the STEM field was I was always interested in math and science in elementary and middle school and high school. But I really didn't have an opportunity to really know people who worked in those fields. And it wasn't until after my sophomore year in high school that I had an opportunity to participate in a summer research program sponsored by the American Chemical Society called Project Seed. This program was essentially for economically disadvantaged, but also for students who tended to not be in the STEM fields, like your minority students or underrepresented students. And I worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory for that summer, and that was really my first introduction to what it was like to work in the STEM field. I got to talk to engineers and scientists, get tours of a facility that really focused in STEM, and learn from different students who were also interested in STEM. And it was really that program, while it's called Project Seed, it really did plant a seed for me. It planted that seed for me to find a place where I felt really comfortable and also excited about a place where I could see a career for myself in the future.
Thank you so much, David. Dr. David Chavez is the Deputy Group Leader for Los Alamos National Laboratory's High Explosives Science and Technology Group. Thank you for joining us, David.
Thank you.
Hi, Joe. This is Sarah Del Valle. My story is also kind of similar to David's. I also always liked math when I was in school, and especially in junior high when I was introduced to algebra, trigonometry. It was, I joke that I used to get like red when I used to work on math exams, just because I had this adrenaline and I was so excited to do a math exam. And so, but I also didn't really know a lot of people that were working on STEM fields, and I didn't really know that I would actually become a mathematician. So in high school, my calculus professor suggested that I go to an Institute of Technology because they focus on STEM fields. And even though I didn't really know what I wanted to be, when I grew up, he felt that I was going to be able to find what I liked in that kind of institution. And so I ended up majoring in math, but I thought I would be a math professor because that's what I thought, that was my only introduction to math. It was all my math professors. But during a summer internship at Cornell University, I was introduced to this area of mathematical epidemiology. And so basically it's using mathematical approaches to study epidemics. And I just fell in love with that area. And I decided to pursue a PhD in mathematical epidemiology. And while I was working on my PhD, I also got the opportunity to come here to Los Alamos for a summer internship. And I decided to just become a scientist, and math professor was no longer an option for me because I felt like doing research fulfilled my dreams and what I wanted to be. And so that's how I ended up being STEM.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. Now, Dr. Sara Del Valle has been a scientist in the Information Systems and Modeling Group at Los Alamos National Laboratory for the past 15 years. She has worked on developing, integrating, and analyzing mathematical and computational models for the spread of infectious diseases. Most recently, Dr. Del Valle has been investigating the role of internet data and other disparate data streams on real-time infectious disease forecasting, including COVID-19 forecasting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, hi, Joe. It's good to see you again, and pleasure to be here with my my former LANL colleagues. So my name is Gabriel Montagno, and my path was a little bit different, I guess. I never planned on being a scientist. I didn't go to school to be a scientist. I think we talked about this in the podcast maybe a little bit. I went to school as an English and journalism major because I wanted to be the editor for Q or Mojo magazine. And I still love to write. It's kind of my passion, both in creative writing and prose. But I was always decent at different aspects in STEM. And I happen, I just happen to be, there's a lot of similarity though, that where it was mentoring, it was people finding me along the way that just kind of pointed me in the right direction in terms of what I could do in the area of STEM and finding a path. I ended up switching my major to biology, and then moved from biology to biophysics and material science, and the rest is history. But it really was a circumstance of just a lot of really positive influences in my life that happened to come along at the right time when I was trying to seek a path, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to be, and finding out that I actually had the talent to be successful in this field. And one of the things that I think resonates with this, I think one of the aspects, it's hard when you're coming from a minoritized background and you don't see anybody that looks like you. So you don't really plan to be that, because why would you? There's nobody that kind of represents what you could see yourself being. So usually it takes those influences coming along the way to help make you realize, wow, this isn't just a pipe dream. This is something I might actually be able to do.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was a great response. Appreciate it, Gabe. Now, Dr. Gabriel Montagno is the professor and department chair for Northern Arizona University's Department of Applied Physics and Material Science, as well as the university's Chief Diversity Fellow and MIRA Chief Scientist. So thank you all so much for joining us today here on the podcast. Appreciate you taking time to speak with us. So now we'll just jump right into the rest of the questions. I'm really excited for this one. I'm excited to see the path this conversation takes. Now, have any of you had any difficulties or challenges in school or in your career due to your Hispanic heritage? How did you navigate those difficulties?
So this is David. I would say that from my own experiences, that my difficulties or the challenges in school were not like extremely difficult to manage, but I did have a few. I had a couple, like has been mentioned before, when there aren't a lot of people that are of the same background as you in an institution or at a school, you can be mistaken for the job, people in the jobs where there are more people that look like you. So, getting mistaken for not being a student and being, like a person who was in the crafts or the janitorial services or things like that. And along those lines, maybe not being taken as seriously, just, based on first impressions and looks, because people think that you belong to a certain type of job category and maybe not really a student or staff member or whatever. I did have a few instances where there were some sort of, I would say, overt like racist comments or things like that, but those tended to be fewer and far between. But the way that I managed or how I dealt with the situation was to find those students that were similar backgrounds or just other underrepresented minorities, and join those clubs at the schools. But I also in as an undergraduate and in graduate school, I chose advisors that were also underrepresented minorities, and use them as mentors and ask them to help guide me in some of the challenges that they faced, and teach me what they learned and how to sort of move forward.
Same here. I think being the only person in a room, and for me, I'm a female and I'm Hispanic, so I have two things working against my favor. And so it's sometimes hard to get your voice heard when you're in a room of people that, obviously none of them look like you. And I think, like David mentioned, finding people that finding mentors and finding champions that can help you kind of navigate a lot of these systems and help you address some of the difficulties if you feel like you're not being invited to attend certain meetings that you should have been invited to. There are people that can work behind the scenes and help you. And for me, I think the way I have been able to navigate these challenges is, through mentorship, but also trying to remind myself that I belong in that room and that I have the credentials, and trying to make sure that I'm confident about why I am there and why my voice needs to be heard, and not feeling, that that I shouldn't be in that room, you know what I mean? And so I think that that's what's helped me address some of those challenges.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Sorry, Joe.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just hearing from my colleagues here just resonate very well with everything they're saying. And I think we talked about this in the podcast I did before, Joe. My path into advocacy is not a direct one, and I give a talk called "I Wasn't Born with a Chip, I Earned It," and I spend a good part of that talk talking about how I was walking. I was actually, I was very much part of the typical science field starting off, and that I was assimilating into it. I was trying to be what I wasn't, because everything I saw was not me. And I wasn't this natural born advocate fighting for years. I was fighting against myself, and that's one of the difficulties that I think a lot of students face, is they're trying to be part of a world that is not naturally where they look like they belong, for good reason, because there's not enough of us there, right? And it prevents a ton of difficulties. And I think that was the biggest thing for myself. I always tell students, it took me a long time. I was well into my professional career before I ever was worth a damn as a scientist. And the big reason I feel like that is because I was only half myself. I was trying to be a white man, and I'm not. And I don't think like one, and I don't do things like one. And that's not a negative. It's actually a strength. I'm pretty damn creative. But it took me a long time to realize that was actually a bonus and a benefit to what I do, and it's all of those little things. And, I talk about this, that it wasn't one singular event, it's a series of paper cuts. And those paper cuts were things like, being told, I would have got that fellowship too if I looked like you. I talk about a story at Los Alamos, and I love Los Alamos and everything. It's nothing unique to there, but there's a taxi service there, and being mistaken for a taxi driver, because when I was a postdoc about ready to become a staff member, because God forbid I was a staff member, right? Because there just weren't enough of us. I mean, you've got 3 of the few current or former, Latina staff members at Los Alamos, right? There's not a whole heck of a lot. And it's nothing against Lano, because there's just not a lot in this area of STEM, right? They're no less or more diverse than anything else. And that's part of the problem. It's just, you're existing in a world where you're always at a significant minority. And as Sara was mentioning, then you can combine these things that are not uniform. My wife, she's German, she's white, but she's a theoretical physicist, and she's always the only female theoretical physicist in the room, and there are other pressures there and disadvantages. So in terms of like navigating these, the truth is, I agree, you find mentors, you find people. For me, it was finding things like SACNAS, Society Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, that helped me. finding like-minded folks. And then at some point it switched to just becoming, you know, an advocate and pushing hard. And, you know, my goal, why I fight through these things now, as much as anything, is not for me, it's for my son. I've given up on it ever changing for me. You know, I think I told you the last podcast, it wasn't more than a few months ago, I can be in the grocery store and I get yelled at in the produce section for not coming over and helping somebody with their produce, because the world sees who they want to see. And when they look at me, for whatever reason, it's not a scientist, it's not a professor, it's whatever they want to see. And, you know, what I hope, and I think a lot of reasons folks like us do things like this, is we want to change it for the next generation so that they're not facing those same things. That when people look at them, they don't judge what they are, who they are, just simply based upon what they perceive.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you all sharing your experiences, and I think you bring up a lot of fantastic points, especially in terms of finding groups and finding that community, and helping to get comfortable in your own skin as you're new to the sciences in school. So I appreciate you sharing that. And now, speaking about your experiences, continuing with this thread, what do you feel may have contributed to either your difficulties or your successes as you worked along your path in your respective career? What do you think is those driving forces that maybe created that rough patch?
So for me, I would start on the successes. So growing up, my dad, we lived in a mobile home, and he was building our home, you know, next to the mobile home, and he would work on it on the weekends and in the evenings. And it took us probably like 9 years to build this house. And even though I wasn't really aware of it at the time, and it was pretty painful because I wasn't able to go like out and play with friends on the weekends because my dad wanted me there helping him, my brother and I. And he didn't really want us to be playing sports because that would take away his time from our time from working with him and things like that. So, but it taught me two things. It taught me the value of hard work, and it taught me the value of perseverance. And so, you know, he didn't give up. He didn't have the resources to build a home right away. He didn't have the time to build a home. He couldn't pay for one, you know, didn't want to get a mortgage to do that. He didn't think he could afford something like that. And so it taught me this sort of work ethic that I don't think I realized I had until later on. And when I went to my undergraduate school, it was pretty difficult. And I think it was those lessons learned early on in life that kept me, you know, working at it and not giving up, you know, looking at the example of my dad and my parents of not giving up on something, even though it's really hard. But at the same time, I think that, like Sarah said previously, there can be this tendency to fall into a way of thinking or a mindset that when you start seeing other people and you don't look like them, maybe you didn't go to the same schools and you don't feel like you're prepared, that you start the self-doubt, and you may fall into the imposter syndrome sort of mindset. And even after, you know, graduating from undergrad and doing really well there in grad school, I still felt like, man, everyone's going to know I'm a fraud, that I don't know what I'm talking about. They're going to see right through me. So it kind of sticks with you until you have to make that decision yourself. I don't know that anyone can tell you anything that's, you know, just going to flip a switch for you. I think you have to come upon the realization of yourself that you do belong and that your voice is important to speak out and be heard. And it does take some time though. So I would say those two things, experiences from my childhood, and then also just I guess, over time building the confidence that maybe isn't there. And I think a lot of that is almost self-imposed lack of confidence, I guess.
Well, and thank you both for talking about imposter syndrome. I think it's something that a lot of us have felt, and a lot of the people listening, whether that's students or the parents and guardians and teachers, we've all from time to time felt that imposter syndrome. And I think it's important to talk about it because it's something that we all deal with. It's something that I think is natural, and knowing that other people are going through it allows you to take ownership of it and say, you know what, I can overcome that. So I thank you for bringing that up, because that is really an important discussion to have.
So for me, I mean, I've had many difficulties that have helped me also get to where I am. I'm an immigrant. I came to the US when I was 16. And so I had to learn English. I had to navigate the, you know, the system of going to college. My parents didn't speak English. And so I had to find people to help me navigate. And I always used to think like, well, maybe if I had been born here and I didn't have an accent, and I didn't have to learn English, maybe that would have helped me, you know, succeed faster or get to where I am faster. But I feel like having that challenge, it gave me a better appreciation and understanding of different people and different challenges that we all have to overcome. And obviously every person has different things that they have to learn. You know, for me it was English, but maybe some people think that they can't learn math just because it's, you know, natural to think that math is hard. But I think with perseverance and hard work, anyone can learn it. And so I think, you know, that was one. I think that navigating the college admission process, it's also pretty challenging, especially when you're, you know, when you're in a situation where your parents can't help. And so having resources and mentors to help you navigate those types of systems helped me. And also, I think Gabe mentioned this having kind of, and also Dave mentioned having collaborative networks and environments. I always found people that looked like me so that they could also kind of help me move forward. And in school, I remember, you know, I would be really good at math, but then other people would help me with, like, you know, some other courses. And so we would work in a group, and I'm like, okay, I'll do the math homework, someone does the chemistry homework, and then we all kind of like shared, you know, our responses. And so having a group of people to work with, I think was really helpful for me to get to where I am, so that I didn't really have to learn a lot of history or other things that I didn't really enjoy.
I could have used Sara for my math homework, definitely in our group. No, I want to resonate completely with what both David and Sara have said. You know, here it's you know, when I look back at one thing that, and I think I mentioned this in the previous podcast, the greatest gift that my parents ever gave me was that I never doubted I was going to go to college, even though I had no idea that they had no clue how they were going to pay for it. So, you know, I ended up doing well and being a good student, and I got a scholarship, all that good stuff, right? But outside of that, they still would have found a way to get me there, even though it was never a given, you know, but I just didn't doubt that. And not having that doubt that I could attend college is the greatest. I'll never be able to repay them for that. And I can't imagine how many sleepless nights they had just trying to figure out how the hell they were going to get me and my brother to college. But they did. And that's probably the greatest thing I could have received. But, you know, and to piggyback off of what Sara was saying about this in terms of, you know, the admissions process, but it's there, and then it never ends, right? So the biggest struggles you face, and this isn't necessarily a Latinx thing, but it just resonates with minoritized communities. Most are first gen. You know, the highest percentage of first gen students come from minoritized communities. We don't have typically a mom, dad, uncle, aunt that we can go to that's navigated the system and understands not only how do you get an undergraduate, but if you want to go into STEM, how do you get a PhD? How are you successful along the way? What different types of markers should you be hitting along the way? You know, I didn't know what the heck I was doing ever. And so I always felt like my colleagues were a step ahead of me. And I was constantly playing catch up. It literally took half my career to try to figure out what the game was, you know, and I talk about this a lot. I was trying to figure out what the game was. They were playing it because they just had those natural contacts. And that's a hard thing that you just continually are playing catch up. And as Sara mentioned, it starts with admissions, with having a hold on your bursar's account and not knowing why you can't register. But it doesn't end there. It just keeps going. And those things add up. When other students can focus on just making that next step, you're just trying to figure out how to survive. And that's probably one of the biggest difficulties, I think. And along with the imposter syndrome, like was mentioned, you know, I talk to students about this. I have it. I'll always have it. I'll never not have it. I'll constantly fight against it. But knowing I have it helps me to figure out methods to try to move past it, not let it limit what I can do. But it's always going to be a struggle. And, you know, just being able to recognize it and understand that you're working with it, I think helps a lot.
No, that great responses. And, you know, that's a natural segue into our next question, talking about the challenge of, you know, how to get into college and the admissions process, and also that imposter syndrome. I think it really lends itself to the next question. You know, as we revisit the Pew Research Center study from the intro, you know, do you feel that Latinx students face unique roadblocks like that may account for the low percentage of them entering the STEM fields? And if so, what do you think those might be? Like, in addition to, you know, the struggles with the admission process and not knowing what others really take for granted?
So this is David. I have a few thoughts on this. I taught at the local branch of the University of New Mexico. I taught a chemistry class there, and also served on the school board of my local community. And I got to see sort of what are students thinking as they're thinking about going to college, and also once they're there, how are they navigating, you know, even just sort of the community college level. And some of it goes back to their parents, and, you know, what their parents think is possible for them, what their parents think they can afford or can't afford, their level, especially if they're first generation. There's just not a lot of information that they have access to, maybe easily, or maybe they don't trust the information that's given to them. And so it was kind of interesting to be in this. So I've been serving on the board, the Caltech Board of Trustees, for the past almost 5 years. And there was a discussion by the trustees about, you know, how can we make undergraduate tuition free for all students? And we want to bring in more underrepresented students, and we think that this could be a, you know, game changer in that regard, and things like this. And a lot of the discussion at that level was that, you know, if it's free, they'll come, you know. But they just didn't have the insight into what is it actually like to live that life, you know, where they're not even going to apply in the first place, even if it is free, because they don't think they have the scores. They don't think that there's people like them there. You know, there's a lot of things. SAT and ACT testing, that in itself is a barrier for a lot of students.
I think we may have lost David.
And so there's a lot of demand is they just need more exposure. You know, they need exposure at early levels, and that is hands-on, being able to do hands-on research in high school and even earlier if possible, so that they can get some of these successes and they start building this broader network where they start learning from others, and then they can build that confidence and share with their parents. You know, as their parents are coming along with them as they're participating in these things, it becomes easier to kind of overcome these barriers. And that's just my experience from these different organizations that I've participated on.
Yeah, I think I have, very similar thoughts as David. Lack of awareness about opportunities is a major issue, and just because there's an opportunity doesn't mean that people are going to apply. In fact, I was at a workshop and I was talking to a student who was interested in going to grad school, and I mentioned, there's all these fellowships and scholarships that you can apply to so you can go to grad school. But she was telling me, well, I have 4 siblings. My mom is a single mom and she has to work, and so I have to help with my siblings. So if I apply to to go to a college outside of my my community where I live, I wouldn't be able to help my mom. And so there's all these other challenges that people don't think about, and so obviously awareness is one way we can contribute, and not just providing the opportunities but also helping them navigate. I mentioned already, navigating through very difficult and complex systems, and so that's super important. Also, lack of role models. I think that's something that we have been mentioning throughout this podcast. But my husband is Caucasian, but I made a very a decision very, very early on. I didn't want to change my last name because I want people to know that I am Hispanic, and I have a PhD and I'm here, and I want other people to see that through my last name, although my last name could be from many different origins, but most people know that I am from Mexico, and so I wanted to make a very deliberate a very deliberate decision to make sure that other people knew who I was. And we also need more Hispanics in leadership roles, because I think that once you have a person at the top, we can start pulling people up. And that's something that I've been doing for my team. I've been hiring, women and underrepresented minorities and Latinx people. And so now, and it's not that I am necessarily targeting them, I'm trying to just have very diverse pools of people, and they just seem to be rising at the top. And so then we are hiring the best of the pool, and they happen to be Hispanic females. And so now my team, we've been able to, it's almost, we're probably 80-20, like 80% females and underrepresented minorities, and then 20% white males. And so just once you have someone in a position where they can make decisions about hiring and making sure that that there's representation in the team, you are going to be able to attract more people. And so I think that that's one way that we can help attract more people into STEM.
Absolutely. And you mentioned something interesting about the idea of we're not targeting individuals that just happen to be where they're at. I think it's when you open that door, when you encourage it, and like you said, when you're bringing that awareness, it's surprising. But I think there's so many things in place institutionally that makes it so they don't even apply, they don't even look for it, because they don't think it's for them, they don't think it's a possibility. So that creating that awareness, you'd be surprised at what you get. But and for a long time, it was very much, well, there's nobody out there, but we're not actively seeking them. We're not actively recruiting them. We're not talking to them. It's just simply, oh, well, we can't get them, right? So it's a change of thinking, I think, and you said, has to start from the top in order to make real change.
And Interestingly, I was just thinking about when I applied to Cornell to go to a summer program, the reason for why I applied was because the director his name was Carlos Castillo Chavez. And so I saw that name and I said, well, I think I have a chance if I apply, even though it's Cornell. And so if it had been, John Smith, I don't know that I would have applied. And so then having, names that you can relate to and people that you can relate to, I think also it's super important so that you will be able to attract more people that qualify for those positions.
Yeah, this is Gabe, and first of all, I just wanted to applaud Sara for what you're doing with your team there, because that's the only way this happens. That's real change, right? And that's when you actually start seeing a shift in the numbers. And one of the issues, and something that both of you spoke to here that's really important is that, and I talk about this a lot, and I'm actually been working with Lionel on this, and we're trying to do this here. Is we've had 40 years of these programs that were invested on these quote unquote pipeline programs that, if we just get enough students in there, the system will change. We know that's a load of crap. And the reason is because the system doesn't want to change. Change, we're talking about a culture shift. And you're talking about whenever there's change, that means somebody is probably going to be changed out of something that is good the way it is. And in the STEM world, it's very much still a colonial based system, right? It is still predominantly white male. It doesn't make them evil. It's just the way it is. And one of the issues is that no matter how many students we get into the system, they do not, every step you go along the way, we have fewer and fewer. So you have so many getting in. So have we made these big changes in terms of the number of students getting into or pursuing STEM degrees? Yes. But then we see that decrease when it goes to graduate school. We see it decrease again when it goes to the postdoc level, decreases again when it comes to the professional scientist professor level, on until you get to this idea of leadership, and it's almost non-existent. So you get to the position of higher leadership, whether it's a national lab like Los Alamos or an academic institution, and it's almost non-existent because they've gotten just beat out of the system to a large degree. You get tired of it. You get worn down by attrition. But it's the only way that change actually happens. And one of the biggest issues with this is I still think that we evaluate in a completely inappropriate manner. And nothing against my Ivy League colleagues here. I'm very proud of both of them because it's amazing. And those credentials are what open doors. But one of the issues is that we still work in this level where I hear so many times, well, you can't find good students there. Oh, well, show me where they're from. And if it's Caltech, Cornell, or Harvard, I'll look at their application. Otherwise, they're not worth it. But the real problem is you have stories like what Sara mentioned, where, you got students where there are real problems. There are family obligations. There are ties that make them have to go to a local college instead of maybe one of the big ones. And their path might look a little different. But does it mean that they're not capable or have not reached the level of success? Absolutely not. Their path just looks different. But until we start actually reevaluating and looking at how we go through these processes of hiring, it's always going to rely on having people like Sara in there that's going to lead these teams to really look beyond just the basic numbers to make that happen. And we need to find a path to make that more universal. So I really think that the biggest thing limiting us is evaluation. It's not just the recruitment, it's retention and promotion to a large degree. Because as has been mentioned, until students actually see themselves reflected, why on earth should they believe they have a future and a career in that field? And we got to change that first.
Absolutely, and absolutely, and changing that mindset, which is really where all of you are coming from, right? This idea to change the way of thinking. I mean, David, you pointed it out with, in terms of we'll make it free. Well, as all of you have mentioned, that's not necessarily the only roadblock they face. It's easy to say it's an easy fix. Well, let's make it free. Let's give them money. But that's not always the only consideration, whether that's familial or whether that's, lack of confidence in yourself or lack of awareness of even the opportunity to go through it. Changing that way of thinking and understanding that you have to do more. It's not just as easy as throwing money at it and saying that the problem is solved. We have to have real change and change not only how we approach the situation, but how we even think about it. Because otherwise we're just going to keep going through the same motions and saying we tried our best, but it didn't work. But we can get there. And the next question, I'm curious to hear the responses, especially after what we just discussed. Now, obviously with the Pew Center research about, not going into, there not being as many Latinx individuals in the STEM fields in terms of career, that was 2018. But since then, have you seen a positive trend over the last few years in terms of the amount of Latinx students pursuing STEM-related jobs, or has it grown stagnant? I'm just kind of curious what you've seen from your positions.
So from my position, what I've observed is that taking a look at the data with respect to this past year with COVID and many institutions deciding we're not going to require college entrance exam scores because it's just been such a pain for people to figure out how to get these things. And then seeing the dramatic increase in the number of applications these schools are getting, it really sends a pretty clear message that the SAT and ACT scores are a huge barrier for a lot of students. And a lot of those students are going to be your underrepresented students that, would otherwise not apply. And now they're applying. I think some schools are paying attention to that data, and they're starting to think, well, maybe we've been thinking about not requiring these test scores, but maybe we should take a harder look. And some schools, again, are going to do a second year of not requiring those college entrance exams for a second year to see. It puts a huge burden on the admissions teams because they have double the applications sometimes that they normally have to look at. But that's just a really short blip in the last couple of years. And if this is a trend that continues, then maybe that could be a way that is an alternative pathway to get more students to be considered at the admissions level process. But once they're there, there needs to be some support structure in place to keep the students, like Gabe mentioned, with respect to retention, because that's at every step of the way, like Gabe mentioned, you're going to have some of this attrition. And if you can keep that attrition to a minimum, then you can start building that workforce that looks more representative of the population. Right now, it's not in place in a broad sense. Some schools do it well, some don't. But in order to make a big impact, not only do you need to get the students to think that they belong there and apply, but you also need to keep them there once they're on campus, so that they do start considering going into the STEM field in their careers.
So I think I've seen some positive trends over the last few years, and I also think that the new generations, the millennials and the Gen X, and there's been an overwhelming awareness that we need more diversity in the whole sense of the word. It's not just gender, but also race, and also age, and many different in many different aspects of diversity. And I think that will continue. I hope that it will continue to be highlighted. But the current problem, I feel like although we're making positive progress, it's very slow. And I think one of the issues is because, a lot of the people at the top are still boomers and other people that have a very different mindset in terms of expectations. And so we need to continue pushing and breaking those glass ceilings so that we can bring change to all these institutions. And I've talked about just making a change in my team because that's what I have control over. But I hope that I will continue to make that change across also the leadership positions. And I do think that we all need to work together, and we can't work in isolation. You know, it's not just us, but also working with other minority communities, and also working with white male folks to help us make those changes at the top.
Yeah, you know, and I think, you know, one thing, Joe, this is why I really love your podcast and why I think it's so important, because it can reach an audience. And when you do that, it breaks down barriers. When you can introduce them to role models like David and Sara here, that can show them what's possible and what's capable, and provide a blueprint for them to get there. It just really does lower those barriers. And I am hopeful about the direction things are heading. I'm still a little bit nervous about it. I know we'll talk about this in a minute. Recruitment is a very big part of it. Again, I think that the biggest thing in terms of recruitment, I try to encourage, whether I'm talking to administrators or whomever, to stop just thinking about the number, because it's so often put into a just simple number type of game. And the thing that's upsetting about that to me is I can do anything to probably achieve a certain number of individuals and reach a quota if I want. But have I done anything to affect the system to actually make it to where it's going to be effective and getting the end result, which is producing those, you know, providing an environment for the students that is going to be one that encourages them to continue on that path? No, I'm just going to create a number, you know, and like we've been talking about, I can give free tuition, I can do all these different things and get them in the door. So what? Who cares? I'm not going to do much with that, right? And too often administrations and not, you know, universities, labs, everywhere, they're focused on that number. And trying to make a culture shift there, I think, is really important to get them defocused on this idea of just this input number and looking at the culture of what their institution looks like. Only when you start shifting that will you start really making a difference. So are we getting more students in? Yes, but we've seen those trends for a number of years now. And the problem is that even though those numbers are going up, as was mentioned, when you go up into the higher ranks of any type of institution in the STEM area, you see them just fall off really quickly. And especially when you get into the math-based sciences. And so, you know, even that Pew number, it's going to be heavily based on mainly the biological, biomedical sciences. And math seems to be such a great limiter that when it starts getting into math and engineering and physical sciences, that's when the number of minoritized students drops off just precipitously. You know, 2% of less than 2% of all physics PhDs are Latinx, and that number hasn't changed in 20 years. And so when you look at numbers like that, it tells us that, you know, we're not really attacking the barriers that really need to be attacked. And then once we even get them into the system, we're losing them, because those support mechanisms aren't in place to take these really talented students and help them achieve, to minimize that gap. And lastly on this, and I'm being long-winded here, but you know, it gets back to what David was mentioning about the SAT scores. You know, there's a direct correlation between SAT scores and socioeconomics, and for a reason. You know, you probably come from a better school. You might have had an SAT coach. You might have been able to take it 3 times. There's just a reason why it tracks, right? And we can look at the data for years now. We know that that's true. So I'm really happy to see as well that schools are moving away from those, because these standardized tests, there's just a lot of bias built into them, right? And we've got to do better than that in trying to make sure that we're getting students that have the ability, the opportunity. And I think that's a really important thing to do here. It's not about trying to give students who haven't demonstrated an ability or the desire to achieve their gap, not at all. And I get really upset when it gets put in that direction. Well, you're giving an increased advantage. No, you're not. You're trying to minimize disadvantages that exist between these communities for a whole number of reasons that are typically socioeconomic based, right? And so that's all it's trying to do. We want to see everybody achieve their maximum potential based upon an equal opportunity.
Well said.
Joe, I
and thank
forgot to mention something about the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think is the elephant in the room. You know, although it's been helping in some ways with, you know, getting rid of some of the requirements that we've had in place for many, many years. At the same time, I think it may affect a lot of, it's probably affecting a lot of other students and also minorities. And we've seen many articles about a lot of students dropping out because they're going through different challenges, from, you know, losing parents or family members to having like economic challenges. And so I feel like the COVID-19 has brought certain positive things, but at the same time, it's also affected a lot of people in different ways, which I don't think we have been able to measure yet, until, you know, probably we won't be able to see it until later.
And, you know, Sarah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one thing, you know, that resonates with that we saw here, and I think most, you know, academic institutions have seen, like last year when we're almost all in some type of remote form of education, that's not uniform, right? For most of my Latinx students, when they're at home, their access is not the same as students. And again, it breaks down typically along socioeconomic lines. They may be in a place where, and this happened, where mom and dad had to have that broadband for whatever access for their job that took, or the laptop, the one family computer that took precedence over that they're being able to have synchronous types of education. And so they're having to do asynchronous. They didn't, or some didn't, flat out just didn't have access. Our students on the reservation, there is no broadband. They were driving 30 miles to go sit in a parking lot to be able to access the Wi-Fi of a local high school every day. It's just not uniform, right? And so you're absolutely right. Things like the pandemic have just demonstrated this differentiation and this difference in opportunity that's just a reality.
And thank you all so much for providing that fantastic, you know, just insight into all of the issues, you know, that they face. You know, it's you know, it's not a lot of really aggressive programs. A lot of it's passive. A lot of it is just simply, you know, we'll offer it. We'll make it available to them. But that's assuming that everybody's on the same playing field, right? And that's where you really run into those problems. And Gabe, and thank you again for your comment about the podcast. And that's really the driving force of starting this podcast, is the fact that, you know, we've been talking for years about diversifying our distinguished lecture, diversifying our programming, but it wasn't until we took it by the reins and said, no, we're going to actively seek people who are from these backgrounds, who have these different experiences. It wasn't as simple as saying that, oh, they'll come to us. But you start getting the same people over the years. You start getting that, once again, you know, we talk about this, but the older white men who are in these high power positions, as you mentioned, Sarah. And not until we started seeking more out and at different levels did we really start getting that more diverse group, whether it's for the podcast or our distinguished lecture series. And it has to be more aggressive. It has to be more proactive. And it can't just simply be, we're offering it. You know, we started offering, more remote opportunities for field trips for the school district and for other schools. But you see the same schools are the ones who are taking advantage of that one, are the ones who have the technology, who have that at their disposal. You were not reaching the students that would really get the most out of it because they just don't simply have that opportunity. And so we're reevaluating that too for the same things that you're talking about. And it's across, it's not just in STEM or in, you know, these careers, but we're seeing it across the board in a lot of different areas where even at the lowest, even at like these early formative years, we're seeing that divide. And how can we expect them to be like, oh yeah, that's a natural progression for me, when we're just not giving them the tools? And so I really appreciate your valuable insight on that, because I think it's really an important discussion. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that, because it got a lot, you know, gears whirring in my brain in terms of what we can do better, because it takes all of us. It's not just these individuals here are going to solve all of the problems. We have to do it together. And but I'll get off my soapbox. But I really appreciate that, because it is really good, really fantastic points. Now, one thing we're getting into, we've talked a little bit about it, but in our past episodes, we've highlighted resources that encourage students, including those from Latinx communities, to pursue careers in STEM. And there really does appear to be an emphasis placed on keeping them in STEM. You know, it's not just enough to recruit, as we're saying, right? So what do you think institutions need to change or revise in terms of their policies to foster a more supportive environment for Latinx students or employees?
This is David. So in my work with Caltech, that's one of the things that I've tried to emphasize with respect to the increasing the diversity of the student body is really having the support resources available for underrepresented students to be able to do to be able to call upon the people that they need to when they're experiencing challenges and the difficulties in pursuing their degree. So having more funding available for these support resources, having specific organizations within the institution be responsible, so that there's somebody that that is held accountable for retention of students. And I think that could be similar with respect to other non-academic institutions as well, because that really where the accountability lies, where the money is, that's where you're going to make the change. If you don't have anyone that's really accountable for seeing improvements in trends and retention, then those leaps in that area won't actually happen. So you need an administration that is committed to doing that, to finding the resources to make it happen, and then holding people accountable to make sure that it actually happens.
So this is Sarah, and I think one of the things that we can do to retain students in STEM is making sure that we value diversity, and that we, because a lot of institutions say, we want a more diverse workplace, but when you look at the numbers, you don't really see that reflected in their numbers. And so making sure that people really value diversity, but also providing a community for people so that you feel like you belong. I know at Los Alamos, we've had a very hard time recruiting Black people. And I remember in my husband's group, he had a colleague who was Black, and they ended up leaving because it wasn't just about him not having a community, like his children who were in high school, they didn't also have a community. And so they were, the only Black child in I don't know, sophomore classroom or whatever. And so making sure that we are building collaborative and welcoming communities so that people stay. And so it's not just having one person, but having large numbers, or I know you start with one, but you need to keep building on that one. And I think that those are some of the things that we can do to retain people. But also metrics, I think having very objective metrics right now, the way many organizations work, there's very subjective metrics on promotions and on hiring. And so, if just someone comes from a good institution, then you hire them, but you don't really have objective metrics that can apply to everyone. And so that's also something that we can do to make sure that we're retaining people and that we are rewarding them for the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I agree with both David and Sarah on this. From David's perspective, show me your budget and I'll show you, exactly what you care about. And so you need to put money into this and not just talk about we want to see this and hope just by hoping for it that it's going to happen. So you do need to see resources in there. And as Sara mentioned there, we use, again, these archaic means of evaluation that we call objective, but they're not. They're typically biased and based upon just some set ideal that is from decades ago. And they do not encourage minoritized students or first-gen students, for the most part, to continue pursuit to a large degree. And it results in this lack of diversification at the highest levels. And until that happens, like, we're going to continually lose students. They're not going to see a path for them. And it's so sad, because you end up with exactly this scientist who ends up moving his family because of a lack of a community that's never going to build unless we actually can tackle this big problem, which is cultural at its core. It's about changing the culture of an institution and being willing to do so, and understand that you're not going to fix this within 1 year or 2 years. And so until you start seeing those big shifts, it's a tough thing, but we got to keep plugging away at it. That's my goal, my vision the last few years has been trying to change institutions from within. You have to, but also changing them at the highest levels of leadership, like getting them to understand the severity of the problem. And we are at a point of losing intellectual capacity in this country, because as our demographics change, and as we refuse to understand our own limitations that we've implemented in terms of educating a diversified society in the US, and one that is becoming more and more first generation and minoritized, the end result is plain as day. We will lose intellectual capacity. We will be outperformed, and there's no reason for students to succeed in that reason here, or for students from abroad to come here any longer as well. So we've got to take this problem serious, and stop dealing with it. It's similar to climate change. We got to stop acting like it's a problem of the future. Neither is diversification and education in STEM. It's a problem of now. It's not an issue that we have to deal with in 20 years because we're going to see this lack of intellectual capacity. It's happening right before our eyes. And if we don't start making the real investments and start changing policies that actually do shift things, it's going to be too late.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And there was something said at the beginning of this podcast where, talking about that diversity is what brings in different ways of looking at problems, right? It's not just simply getting a number of people on your team, but it is also just changing how you look at problems and the potential solutions, to actually solve those issues. And it takes a wide, collective and diverse group in order to do that. And so it's not just, like you said, a problem of the future. It's something now, and we're seeing it impacting. Where you're driving away these scientists and these potential leaders in the field because they just don't feel that they matter, and that takes everyone, and it does take an active role. So no, yeah, fantastic points, absolutely. And as we wind down, I want to talk about what you all hope the listeners take away from this discussion. We've talked a lot about a wide range really of points, of where we need to make the change in order to have the STEM fields really reflect society as a whole. But so as we look to the future, what do you hope that the listeners, whether they be teachers, parents, guardians, or the students themselves, what do you hope they get from this?
So from my perspective, I hope the students, what they get out of this is that they see three individuals that have gone through their careers, probably have had similar experiences to them, endured similar thought processes and challenges, and still were able to navigate the system and be able to be successful and look at us as role models. Hear from us, the different things that made us able to navigate those challenges that we encountered. For teachers, I'd like especially for secondary teachers in the STEM areas, to really take from this the importance of getting hands-on experiences for students in research opportunities looking for those things that they can do within the school, but also things that their students can apply for so that they can go to other institutions, whether they're academic, national laboratories, or even industry, to get those experiences away from the school and interact with a whole other set of people. Because I really believe that that network building at a very, very early age is extremely important to making those next steps in leaps and bounds. At least they were for me. And then for institutions, you know, I think there needs to be a very strong emphasis, and then a directing of resources. If that's the goal of an institution, is to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, is to make resources available, to find resources to make available to addressing these situations, and then having an organization that values diversity from the top to the bottom, including boards. If possible, people should really look into and potentially get trained in implicit bias, because I think that is something that can impact a lot of decision making. As an example, I often hear the phrase, well, we want to be careful not to lower our standards when we increase, you know, by increasing diversity. And just that statement in itself is biased, because automatically you're saying that when you bring in diversity, you automatically have to lower, you're automatically lowering the standards of the institution. And I don't know that people, when they say that, realize that that's, you know, that's an implicit bias that they have. But by going through the training and you know, really taking it seriously, I think that you can start thinking differently, and then potentially using that different way of thinking to impact the way you make decisions. So those are a few of the things that I would say that I hope listeners take away from the podcast.
Thank you, David.
So this is Sarah. I think some of the takeaways for students is to make sure that they're not alone, because, you know, we didn't also know the answers. We also didn't really know how to navigate a lot of the systems that we had to navigate. And so, but we were able to get mentors and get help, and that's what helped us succeed and get to where we are. And so students, you know, don't, just because you don't know what to do, then don't feel like you can't continue. Just try to find someone that can help you. You can do it. And for institutions or teachers, I think the takeaway from me would be that you can actually make a difference. And sometimes it's easy to feel like, you know, one person can't really make a difference, but we all can make a difference if we really try. And even the small seeds that we're planting are eventually going to grow into trees, and they're going to propagate through the system. And so if you have the opportunity to be in a hiring committee, or you're organizing a workshop, or you know, any kind of opportunity that you have, where if you don't really see a diverse organizing committee or a diverse set of speakers, or and when we talk about hiring committees, people always focus on, oh, we want a diverse candidate pool, but they don't also focus on having a diverse hiring committee. And so if you don't have a diverse hiring committee, even if you have a diverse candidate pool, you're not going to hire, you know, or do justice to diversity. So we all can make a difference through our participation in many different activities. And so I just want to encourage students and I mean teachers and institutions to make sure that they're doing their part. And also, you know, feel free to contact me if you're interested in a summer internship here at Lano, and feel free to contact people and in different institutions if you're interested, because I think that's how we're going to start increasing the numbers. And sometimes when we put out job ads and we don't have a diverse pool, don't hesitate to apply, because we are really interested in hiring people like you.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah, and with teachers, I just want to give a big thank you. You're just underappreciated, and I know firsthand how much hard work you do. And my brother's a high school math teacher, and he's affecting lives on a daily basis. And I'm so proud of him and everything he does. And all my other family, my sister-in-law is also a teacher, and cousins. I come from a lineage of teachers. And I have so much admiration for everything they do. And so thank you so much. And please keep doing what you do, and know that there are a lot of folks like ourselves who really appreciate you and are just in awe of your commitment to the next generation of leaders in this country. For institutions, I think my colleagues just nailed it. And David, thanks for bringing up this idea of diversity and excellence being tethered. These are mutually exclusive entities. And I was on a panel not too long ago where that question was posed, and I just went off because I just get sick and tired of hearing this idea that diversity means a watering down of excellence. It's just a load of crap, and it is biased. And until, the biggest issue, and I think we talked about this, Joe, in my previous one, the goal oftentimes to prevent change is to keep debating whether a problem is real. And when you ask questions like that, which, well, if we increase diversity, don't we decrease excellence? It has one goal, which is to debate whether or not there's a validity to this idea of needing to diversify. And honestly, I don't have time for those anymore, because they're loaded questions that refuse to even accept the reality of our situation. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think it's so important. And institutions need to move beyond that. And as Sarah mentioned, this idea that, well, as long as we get a diverse candidate pool, we're doing our job. No, this is about shared responsibility, folks. And it's not enough to just I agree, we need more diverse hiring committees, but we can't just always burden our women and minorities to do these jobs, right? I can't be on every committee across campus, which oftentimes gets asked, and neither can David or Sara. You have a responsibility, whether or not you're a minority or not, to learn and understand the issues, to become informed about implicit bias, about imposter syndrome. You don't have to be one of us to be a champion, to be an ally. And I want to make sure that, we're clear about this. You're not inherently the problem. We welcome you to be part of the solution. All my white male colleagues out there, I tell them all the time, I want you to be part of the solution, and I'm happy to help you get there. But you are not devoid of a responsibility just because you haven't had my lived and shared experience. We can get there, but it takes all of us getting there together. And so I welcome you to be part of the journey and part of the fight for what is right. And to the students, the biggest thing I want to say to you is to make sure that you enter into these debates and conversations with knowledge and with data. Data is your friend. Make arguments based on data. If you want to move the needle, know the data. Tweeting is easy. Being provocative is easy. That's not hard. Change is hard work, but damn it, it's worth it. It is so worth it when you can actually make something better, to actually affect the future. And all of them can do it. All of our students, all of you can do it. We're counting on you. We're getting older. We need other people to come in and take on this fight, and it's worth it. It's a worthwhile fight. And your future is bright. I don't want you to leave feeling like, gosh, do I really want to be in this? No, you do. I tell students all the time, I have the best job in the world. I get paid to play for a living. I come up with crazy ideas, and then I got to try them. There's nothing like being a scientist. And you absolutely, completely belong as a scientist. Right. And I don't want them to be deterred that it's not something they can do or not something they should do. If you want to, we're here to help you. And we want to see you succeed, and we want to see you help change the face of what STEM looks like. So our hopes are in you, and we're just very proud of you. So keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Gabe. And I think if I, hope listeners take away anything, it's that there are people, and you can hear them on this podcast. There are people who are in the fields that are trying to change it from within, that are passionate about bringing you in and giving you those opportunities that maybe they might not have otherwise had. And they want to make sure that, there's always those opportunities, and that it takes all of us to make that change, but they are there and they're working to make a change. And I hope that if this, for those, who are listening who aren't part of the Latinx community, I hope you gain some insight into the challenges that do exist, as they were all of our guests were talking about, and be empathetic. We oftentimes look at being sympathetic, something we've dealt with, but sometimes you need to be empathetic and say, I don't know what you're going through. But at the same time, though, I still want to support and I want to learn. And learning what your fellow students or fellow colleagues are going through, even though you may not get it, you need to, sometimes it's worth just listening, because it makes a difference to them and it makes a difference to you in the long run. And so thank you all so much for taking time to speak with me today. And thank you to everyone out there for listening to this podcast. If you would like to learn more about our institutions, you can visit our websites at nationalatomictestingmuseum.org, lanl.gov, nau.edu, and mira.nau.edu. You can find the NATM on Facebook and Twitter by searching Atomic Museum. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. It was fantastic having you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.